In this video, I'll be replacing the alternator on a later model Porsche 944. Some signs of a failing alternator include dim or flickering headlights, weak or dead battery, slow or malfunctioning accessories, difficulty starting or frequent stalling, grinding or whining noises, and a dash warning light or a low voltage reading. The OEM alternators are no longer in production for these cars, but there is a pretty good supply of remanufactured ones available from a variety of vendors. They're typically priced around $200 to $300 with a $100 core charge in many cases, which is refundable after returning your used alternator. I picked this one up on eBay from a reputable electric company for $160, and with shipping and tax it came to $198. I chose it because there was no core charge and it came with the fan blade and the pulley already installed, and it's said to be upgraded to 130 amps, so I figured I'd give it a shot. And while I'm in there, I'll also be replacing the cooling duct and some new clamps with this kit that I got from 944online.com. Like a lot of parts on these cars, the alternator was updated throughout the iterations of the 944. So the bracket size will be the same early to late, but the early cars featured just a 5-ribbed belt on the pulley versus 6 ribs on the later cars, those after 1985 and a half year refresh. The early cars also just had a 90 amp output versus 115 amps on the later cars. So if you're going to be swapping alternators forward and back between models, just make sure that the pulley is the correct type for your setup and that it is shimmed and adjusted correctly to support proper operation. On this car, there's been a loud whirring sound coming from the front of the engine during operation, and I originally thought it was an aging roller on the drive belt system. So I recently replaced the timing and balance shaft rollers, and I could still hear the noise after starting the engine, and I just so happened to spin the blade on the alternator with my hand as I was finishing up the rebuild, and it sounds like the bearing is going bad there. The alternator functions otherwise, but I'm curious to see if that will clear up the noise, and also the refreshed output, if it'll speed up the power windows and the pop-up headlights, which have been moving up and down a little slow, or if that's just aging motors on those components. So we'll see how it turns out. Replacing the alternator is a pretty straightforward process on the naturally aspirated cars. The turbo cars require the extra steps of draining some coolant, removing the coolant hose to the expansion tank, and the intercooler outlet pipe and things, none of which we'll have to do on this NA car. But to remove the alternator, we'll first need to lift the car on jack stands or ramps, disconnect both the positive and negative terminals on the battery, remove the airflow meter and air filter housing, detension and remove the AC alternator ribbed belt, remove the air diverter from the rear of the alternator, and disconnect the electrical cables. I've got the car lifted and the battery terminals disconnected, so next I will be removing the air filter housing and airflow meter. There are 3 10mm nuts in front and 2 bolts in back. Disconnect the ventilation line from the belt cover, the J-boot, and use a little flathead to pull connector on your airflow meter, and the housing lifts right out, and that will expose the alternator. With the air filter housing removed, we can now go below the car and remove the ribbed belt. Here's the belt tensioning system below the car. To completely remove the alternator and AC belt, we would have to remove the power steering pump belt, but in this case I'm just going to pull it off the upper pulley, so I'll leave that in place, and we'll need to loosen the 17mm bolt on the AC compressor on the front and the 13mm in the back. Then we can release the 2 17mm lock nuts on the adjustment arm and turn the arm to release tension, and then we'll pull the belt off the top. Now that the belt is loosened, we can just remove it from the top pulley and drop it out of the way. Also below the car here is the air intake for the alternator cooling system. And this is the ventilation duct that we'll be replacing. This one's in pretty rough condition. And there's one hose clamp here, and the hose clamp on the upper connection is actually missing, so that'll be easy. And then we'll disconnect the air diverter from the back of the alternator, and that will expose the electrical connections. With the ventilation duct out of the way, the air diverter can be removed. It's secured to the back of the alternator with 3 8mm nuts, 2 on top and 1 on the lower right. There is a 4th stud over here on the left that's not used, I'm assuming because it's too tight to get a wrench in there. But we'll get that pulled off and then disconnect the 2 electrical connections. And the final step will be the 17mm mounting bolts. With the air diverter removed, we can now see the 8mm and 13mm connection points for the electrical leads. And before we pull these off, just make sure that you have completely disconnected the wiring harnesses from your battery terminals. With the drive belt, the ventilation system, and the electrical connections disconnected from the alternator, it can now be removed from the car. It is secured by 2 mounting bolts, 17mm, one on the upper left and one on the lower right. Go ahead and get those pulled out, and the alternator will just lift right out of the car. The bolt on the lower right is a nut and bolt setup that will need to be removed from below the car. The upper bolt is quite long, so in removing it, if you happen to run into a clearance issue, the cooling fan assembly can be disconnected and lowered down for some extra space in removal. Here's a look at the 2 alternators side by side, the old one and the new one. This is the Bosch AL170X unit, and the original one is in pretty rough condition, heavily oxidized inside and out. And when I tilted it on its side, this rock actually fell out. So there's no telling how long that was in there bouncing around. But the new one has been cleaned and reconditioned, repainted with all new hardware and electronics, and is a lot smoother over the old one. When I pulled the air diverter off, the foam gasket basically crumbled into bits, so I'm going to use some 3M foam adhesive to make a new gasket for it and get the new air duct connected up. And before I put in the new alternator, I'll probably also clean up the aluminum mounting bracket on the engine just a bit, get some of the oxidation off there as well. Installing the new alternator will be essentially the reverse of removal with a couple items of note. So we'll go ahead and get the alternator into position on the mounting bracket and thread the 2 mounting bolts. These 17mm bolts have a torque value of 33 foot-pounds. So we'll make sure that those are tightened down appropriately. Reconnect the electrical leads to the back of the alternator. Reattach the air diverter. Then we'll go ahead and connect the cooling duct to the top and bottom locations with the new clamps. With those items in place, we can reattach the ribbed belt. And as the belt is going on and tensioned, it will be tensioned to a deflection point of 2mm on the lower span. So if you apply moderate thumb pressure up into the belt, it should move approximately 2mm, and you'll know that it's tight enough. Once the belt is installed, it's time to reinstall the air filter housing and airflow meter and reconnect the power connection to the airflow meter, and finally reconnect the positive and negative leads to the battery terminals. And then it's time to start the engine and see how it runs. Well, after testing the alternator, I noticed immediately that the car started a lot easier. It only turned over about 1 revolution before it fired up on a cold start, which was pretty cool. Normally it would take 2 or 3 extra cranks to get it going on the old alternator. And the voltage is showing up a lot higher on the dash. It's coming in just under the 14 volt mark, whereas the old one was just above the 12 volt mark. Some of the accessories have improved speed as well. The windows are going up and down a little bit more freely, and the pop-up headlights are a little quicker to pop up. The engine noise has quieted down a bit. I'm hearing less of the whining sound and more of just the heavy belt noise, which is common to these cars. So overall, looks like a pretty good upgrade to the car. The new alternator looks better, it's quieter, and has improved output. And now I have an old alternator that I can sell or have rebuilt and keep it as a spare.